when it becomes bigger than just black women, when it comes into contact with others who have similar projects, then black feminism encounters other forms of feminism. The problem has been that other forms of feminism, like white feminism, have been identified as universal and the only feminism. People ask me when I first came to Brazil, and I have to say it was over a decade ago, actually 15 years ago at this point, and I've only lately gotten back. But what stood out for my first trip was the first place I landed in Brazil was São Paulo, and I was on a faculty development seminar, and they took us everywhere. We spent an entire day following from the beginning to the end issues of landless people. We started in a favela, so they could give us a sense of how people were living and how they needed more land, more space, better housing, those types of issues. But then they took us to the town, which actually felt like a town or a community of people who were living in the garbage dump from land that they took back, that was land that technically was not useful or used. And actually we had a seminar there where some of the leaders of that community sat down and explained to us what they were trying to do and took us all around this community. It really convinced me that people can build community in many different places, and that community is in fact fundamental to political action, because this was a community that was founded from political action. And if that weren't enough, they said, get on the bus. We want to take you to the land where the landless people were getting, because the government was very interested in, as to the best of its ability, administering a policy of taking land from people who had let that land run fallow. They may have owned it in title, but they were not using it, they were not living on it. And so we went and actually saw another community that were the same people from the community that the landless people put together. What would it be like if you actually got land and could live in an area where the water was better, where the air was better, where everything was better? It was a long day, and it's one of the first days that I spent in Brazil. And make no mistake, that was a very memorable day for showing the structure of it all and how land and class matter, but also for showing me the politics of how people responded to that. So that was my introduction to Brazil, and I fell in love immediately with Brazil. Well, there's some parallels between homeless people in the U.S. and landless people perhaps here, because, and there's certainly people, I notice the people who are on the streets here, and which people are on the streets and where they are in the cities. And that is very much the same situation in the U.S. It was a surprise to me the first time I saw someone sleeping on the street in the U.S. because we had a strong social welfare state that took care of people, so they had somewhere to live. And we also had a social welfare system where if you had health issues, particularly mental health issues, you were not sleeping on the street with medication and nowhere to go. So it was shocking the first time I saw someone, because it never occurred to me that a culture would let that happen if it had the wealth not to let that happen. So that was really my reaction in the US. That all started in the 80s. And before, I don't know what was happening here, but that was under the government of Ronald Reagan. When the Reagan administration came in 1980, it looks kind and gentle now from the perspective of today. But at the time, they instituted policies to shrink the social welfare state that they felt was giving away unduly benefits to unworthy people. And a lot of those unworthy people who were targeted were in fact black people. And a lot of those people, of those black people, were black women with children. So you can connect the dots from state policy all the way down to your everyday life, and recognizing that state policies change, for the better. For a policy that's trying to redistribute land so that people have a place to live, to policies that don't care and say, we don't care if you die on the street, that's your bad luck. Black feminism comes from solving problems in your everyday life. It doesn't come from ideology. All right. In fact, sometimes black women don't want to call themselves black feminists because the ideology that comes from white feminism they often see as inappropriate and doesn't apply to their lives. And they're right. So if you start with what I would call an indigenous feminism, whatever it is, people who see the need for feminism in their life, or who see how gender is operating, or who come to see it through other types of struggles, whether it's a land struggle, a class-based struggle, or whether it's a race-based struggle, and recognize that within their everyday life there are things that cannot be solved just by thinking about race or thinking about class. It's not just racism, it's not just class, it's a form of gender power as well. So that feminism from its beginning, black feminism, was very much drawing from something that was pretty comprehensive and analytical without being named. See, we are so conscious of naming everything and then turning it into an identity. I'm going to name this thing called black feminism that has a program attached to it. Then I'm going to go find the people who claim that identity. That's really a modern way of looking at this. That's a contemporary way of looking at this. I instead am looking much more, or have always thought, that the issue is much more grounded in how you're living, what's around you, and problem solving. And I have given people on the bottom, I just assume that they are rational about solving problems in their lives. I do not believe the general discourse about black people are not as smart, or black people are inherently violent, or they're more sexual. All of that is fairy dust to kind of hide the nature of the power relations that keep black people down. So a feminism that's a black feminism is going to come from people, from women who've been identified as black women. They don't have to choose to be that. They have been designated that. And the issue is, what does that mean in your everyday life, and if your everyday life is connected to everybody else's everyday life? It's much more collective. So for me, it's a process of building this analysis and set of action strategies that address the issues that black women face. Now, when it becomes named, when it becomes bigger than just black women, when it comes into contact with others who have similar projects, then black feminism encounters other forms of feminism. The problem has been that other forms of feminism, like white feminism, have been identified as universal and the only feminism. And then what should happen is these poor black women who just don't understand feminism need their consciousness raised as feminists. Well, this is an erroneous discourse, and fortunately many black women have pushed back against that. I think we're all in a different place now to be open to other ways of looking at black feminism. Inequality is fundamental to society. Why wouldn't inequality be fundamental to your politics? See, it's only people who think inequality doesn't matter they're the ones benefiting from inequality. If you're not benefiting, why would you need somebody to explain to you that you're not? What you need is to develop an analysis of how that's organized and how it works. You need an analysis that says, here's why black women are paid less. Here is the discrimination in the system. Here is the discrimination in attitudes and values in terms of how people view you. And it's not enough to even stop at the diagnosis, to say, we see it. The next step is to analyze, what do you do about it? What actions do you take? And the actions that you take affect your analysis, and your analysis affects your actions. To me, that's another important point in black feminism. It isn't just actions, it's not just activism, but it's not just ideas. It's this really calibrated response to these challenges of discrimination, of inequality, that are particular to black women, right? They take particular form, but they are not unique to black women, right? So the uniqueness has to be the coalition between black women and other groups. If you want a solution to a holistic problem, You have to have a holistic and robust analysis. So let's say violence is a really good example here. If I look at African American communities, violence is a major problem. There is state-sanctioned violence, and that's the violence we're really used to seeing, the violence of extrajudicial killings by police. And that's clearly important. And that is something that has very much impacted men more than women directly, because men tend to be on the street more. The whole notion of public space and private space. So who is more likely to be harassed in public space is the person who's more likely to be in public space. So that, but if we mistake within black communities that kind of violence as the only kind of violence and say all black people experience this violence, well, it's true up to a point, but it's not adequate for politics. We have to also look at state-sanctioned violence that's against black women. That would have been the whole history of rape, all right, and not prosecuting people who have raped black women. But the difficult question when you start looking at gender differences, if it's just a basic gender difference, men and women and how we experience state violence, then you can just stop analysis on a very superficial level. But if you really want to ask the question how violence has really embedded itself in the fabric of black communities, how domination that comes from racism and sexism and capitalism and all that is within relationships between black people. You see a very different situation around violence, quote, domestic violence, things like that, masculinity, femininity. So your political project becomes bigger the more you think about these categories of race and class and gender and sexuality. But how do you remediate the pain that black women who are at the intersection of that feel without a comprehensive analysis that encourages black women to look at both the penalties that they experience but also the privileges? Because there are women who beat their children. All right, I'm just going to say things like that. These are the types of discussions that have to happen. But in a culture that is looking very hard to find ways to demonize black people, it becomes difficult to have those discussions. So it's easier to deflect onto white women. You know, white women don't understand us. Well, so what? They don't. Okay, end of story. Okay. Women of means often are not affected by these arguments. So they can take these positions of right to life, they can take these high-minded positions because they're not the ones that are affected by the lack of reproductive services, education and services. It's much bigger than abortion. It really is a women's health issue, and it's a global issue. And these are the people, black women are the ones who are most affected, but not just black women. So I just want to say that. I think it's really important to frame an issue like this in terms of all the people who are harmed when you do not fund a healthcare system that provides services and where you say to some women, we're taking the decision making away from you. One thing that has been very good about the white feminist movement or the feminist movement is its recognition of the absolute need to have women's health care high on the list of what you fight for. In the U.S., Planned Parenthood has just been in the bullseye, you know, in terms of that's the organization where a lot of black women, Latina women, poor women, they're using these services because they don't have private physicians, they don't have health insurance. And so going after those types of organizations that are not just doing abortion, but they're providing full service health services for women who cannot afford it or can't find it anywhere, it's just really tragic. And then you turn around and you don't take care of the children they have, that they were trying not to have. So what does that say about the moral, ethical position of these people? That they're so insensitive to other people's lives. And black women are right in the center of that, but not just black women. I never set out to be a public person. I never set out to be a public figure. That was just not something I thought of. I was just doing the work that I thought needed to happen. That's what I was doing 30 years ago, writing Black Feminist Thought. My first little book written for my students, who were, a lot of them young black women, and I said, I have to write the book that black women should have been able to read, and maybe this will help. I think it's about the power of ideas to mobilize people, and what those ideas are. And that has convinced me of the significance of intellectual work, which is often dismissed, as a friend of mine said, as academic bullshit. I don't do academic bullshit. That's not at the heart of what I'm trying to do. It is really doing high quality analysis. It's listening to people who are in fact doing high quality analysis. And there are often people on the bottom who understand their situation. Black women who understand their situation far better than any academic who comes in and attempts to explain their lives to them. So I have really tried in my career, I've been an insider, and I've wanted to get power within the academy, because the academy is the place that really legitimates a lot of our knowledge. So that's what I've been doing very methodically, purposely, publishing. I have been following the rules, but subverting the rules at the same time.